We are recording this episode on Thursday, March 27th, 2025. What the hell happened yesterday is the question that is on everybody's mind in the auto industry. And to break down exactly what happened yesterday with the new administration announcement on tariffs and to understand the impact to our beloved automotive industry, I am thrilled today to bring on the show Glenn Stevens. Most of you in this industry know Glenn. He is the Executive Director of MichAuto. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jan. Thanks for having me. It's an interesting day today, but I look forward to chatting with you about it.
All right, let's start with MichAuto. Now, MichAuto is leading the voice for Michigan's automotive and mobility industry to promote, retain, and grow our state as a global epicenter for research, engineering, development, and advanced manufacturing. That is taken directly off of your LinkedIn profile, Glenn, so we all understand what MichAuto is all about. Now, with the Trump announcement of 25% on foreign goods with the intent of bringing manufacturing back to America, surely this is good news for you.
It's news. I wouldn't say it's good news. We're really dissecting and digesting what's transpired. We anticipated it. We knew there's going to be a lot of changes with this administration. I don't think we anticipated the magnitude and the velocity of which it's coming at us. So we knew there were going to be trade changes, but this is really a curveball for the industry, one that we anticipated, but we're dealing with today. Are more jobs in America and more jobs in Michigan good? Yes. Is border security, which is one of the initial reasons for some of these moves, it seems like a year ago now, but a couple months ago, is that a good idea? Yes. But the methodology of making these changes and what it means to the impact for the short term and potentially the long term has us concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's break down the announcement that took place yesterday, Glenn. 25% on all vehicles coming into the U.S. from other countries. That was the message that was conveyed by President Trump in the press conference yesterday. Then, as we dive deeper into the fact sheet that's produced on the White House website, we find that it actually includes certain auto parts. And those auto parts are listed as engines, transmissions, powertrain parts, and electrical components. Okay, so now we've got an expansion of that 25% to be not only on vehicles, but on certain auto parts. Then, in addition to that, on the fact sheet, not included in the press conference, but on the fact sheet, it says, importers of automobiles under the USMCA agreement will be given the opportunity to certify their U.S. content, and systems will be implemented such that the 25% tariff will only apply to the value of their non-U.S. content. I think I get that, but Glenn, walk us through what that means. Let's take, for example, a vehicle. Let's take Bronco. Ford makes the Bronco in Mexico. What does that mean?
Yeah, so let's take the big picture first. So last year in 2024, there were 7.68 million vehicles imported. That's a lot. People don't really realize how many vehicles come into this country. We produce a lot of vehicles in the U.S., Mexico and Canada and the USMCA regions, but we do import a lot of vehicles. What that means now is all imported vehicles, no matter what country they come from, they have a 25% tariff that will be levied on them. The exception and the exclusion is if that vehicle is produced in Canada or Mexico, USMCA trading partners, the content of those components that are produced in the USMCA region will be excluded, or you can appeal or apply for an exclusion to that. So let's come back to the Bronco Sport built in Mexico. If that vehicle has components that come from Mexico, US, or Canada, they will be part of an application to exclude from that 25% tariff. That's our understanding this morning.
Okay, so if the vehicle is USMCA compliant, if the parts are all produced within the US, Mexico, or Canada, then that tariff does not apply.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Then on the component side of it, and I'm reading straight off the White House fact sheet here, USMCA compliant automobile parts will remain tariff-free until the Secretary of Commerce, in consultation with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, establishes a process to apply tariffs to their non-U.S. content. So that means that auto parts, if you're USMCA compliant, you can breathe for the moment.
For the moment. And an extreme example of what would not apply, or an example, would be a component manufactured in France. If that vehicle component comes into this country from France directly into a vehicle, that component is tariffed at 25%. That is not a USMCA compliant component.
Okay. What does this mean to the supply base?
I think we have to start at the big picture: vehicle production, vehicle demand, what's going to happen. We already know that consumer confidence in the United States has taken a hit. So there are some signals. We've seen that from the key indicator, key reports. We know from talking to dealers, I've talked to some dealers, the showroom traffic has slowed, and that's not a good indicator either. But now we have 7.68 million vehicles, or a good portion of them. For example, vehicles imported directly from South Korea or Japan or the UK. And there are about 10 countries that make up the bulk of all of the imported vehicles. Those vehicles are now going to have a higher cost to that company that is trying to sell that vehicle, and that will be impacted. The company has one of two choices. It absorbs that tariff, or it passes that tariff along to the consumer. So at the high end, we know that we're going to have a problem on the demand side in the vehicle showroom. There are going to be less products available. Now, when you look at the supply chain itself and you build it up from the bottom, all of those components, and there are a lot that are not USMCA, will now have a higher input cost into that supplier or that module that's built up. And that's going to stack up through the system. Again, companies can pass that through. OEMs and larger tiers can accept those increases, but it's going to stack up to a higher cost for that OEM to eventually bring that vehicle to market. So we are concerned about small suppliers. Their balance sheets are a lot more fragile. There's always fragility at the small suppliers, even large suppliers. So we're concerned about that. So we're really not sure, but some of the forecasts are vehicle production will be decreased in the US because of this, which flows back through the supply chain. That's a concern about jobs and balance sheets. So there's ramifications here that we're looking at.
Yeah. And I think that timing, too, is also an issue. I think sometimes people don't understand the complexity of sourcing in the automotive supply chain. And we have a process for a reason. And we've spent decades very carefully crafting these supply chains that include Canada, Mexico. They are global supply chains. Now, one of the primary reasons is cost. We source in a low-cost country for a reason, because of cost, but we also source for other reasons, such as capacity availability and technology. This announcement covers electrical components, which is a huge umbrella that can cover a lot of different things. In some cases, that technology just isn't available here. It's coming from China, from Taiwan, it's coming from other countries. So to bring that technology here will take at least 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 years.
Yes, depending on the component, and there are thousands of components that come in to make this vehicle, right, in an assembly plant. Depending on the component, where it comes from, the supply and demand, the complexity of it. Is there plastic injection molding capacity? Yes. Not as much as there used to be, but there is. I don't like to use the word commodity, but for shoot and ship parts and things like that, you can move production. But when you get into complex electronics, electrical components, and forgings, the United States does not have a lot of capacity for forgings. And this has evolved over decades. And so to be able to change these things, first of all, it's a supply and demand situation. Second of all, is there labor available, particularly in the skilled trades? It takes time to move it. And there's also process. I like to say that the vehicle, the car or truck or the SUV is the most high-tech consumer product on the face of the earth that has to start every time, and it has to keep their passengers safe. That's why we have the controls we have and all the processes and checks and balances. Things do not move overnight.
Yes. And I get the sense, Glenn, that the current administration is trying to take us back to an era that's long gone. Do we all love this idea of American manufacturing? Of course we do. But we can't do it just by implementing tariffs and somehow a miracle happens and manufacturing capacity appears and it's all okay again. And we're back to the, 50s, 60s, whenever, a time where we had a lot of manufacturing in the US. We're looking back instead of looking forward. I would love to see us look forward to say, okay, what does U.S. manufacturing look like? What should it look like to be globally competitive in today's marketplace? So I get this sense we're looking back instead of forward. What do you think?
Well, I think we're looking a little bit more isolationist than what we have been. But that's not something that just started with this administration. That is something that really started a couple of administrations ago. And is that the right thing to do in a global trade economy? Likely not. Are there forces that we have to reckon with that didn't exist before? Yes, the Chinese automotive industry did not exist 20 years ago. Really, literally, it didn't exist as it does today 5 years ago. And so that's a force we have to reckon with. But it needs to be well thought out. And really, the industry, government has to do this together. In the short term, when we look at the supply and demand situation, I think steel and aluminum, that's another series of tariffs we're dealing with right now. There is capacity in American steelmaking. And so maybe there's some things that can be done there to move things onshore. Aluminum's different. Primary of aluminum is not done in this country because it's so energy intensive. Most of it in North America is done in Canada because they have hydroelectric power. This is, I guess, the reason I'm bringing this all up. It just demonstrates how complex this supply and demand equation is and how it needs to be well thought out, and it cannot change overnight.
Yeah. Glenn, from a global competitiveness standpoint, does this help us in the long term or hurt us?
There's a concern there. Let's look at just our region. We look at Ontario and Michigan as basically seamless. An engine built in Michigan is used in a Windsor assembly plant. An engine built in Ontario is used in an F-150 assembly plant. So we're absolutely interconnected. This region is competitive, and it needs to be more competitive, and automation will play a role there, and technology and advances, and even things like AI. And then you look at the USMCA region, it has to be competitive globally. And there's a concern that if you weaken the strength of the three countries together as an operating block of trade companies, let's just talk about automotive, but it's certainly for other sectors of our economy. What does that do to us overall? If input costs are all higher and the vehicle costs more, does that make us globally competitive or less competitive? It makes us less competitive, and that's the concern.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Chinese OEMs. This is a massive distraction from what we need to be doing, which is figuring out how we operate in the auto industry. And I'm going to bring it back to culture and the way that we do business, but we need to completely reinvent the way we think, our processes, the way that we do business, the culture. We have to focus on that to compete with the BYDs of the world. And this is now a huge distraction. In my mind, it's preventing us from really moving forward. Do you feel that?
I do. I visited BYD about 12 years ago in Shenzhen, and frankly, it wasn't much to write home about, but you could tell that the commitment had been made. I spent the whole day at their R&D headquarters. The vehicle didn't have great finish, and it just didn't have what it needed to have. Well, look at that company now. That company is not only huge and growing, they went from 400,000 in sales to 4 million in sales literally in the last 4 years, but they're innovative. They're very vertically integrated, but they're very innovative in how they use the tools to bring vehicles to market faster, cheaper, and that's what we're competing against. So if we're not we don't have focus and our eye on a ball to be able to compete with that. Let's just use Ford, for example. They know what they're up against. Jim Farley's been very vocal about this. He knows what he has to do. And yes, this distracts from this. We have had complete paralysis and delay in product investment, capital investment. Products have been delayed. And now everybody's going to have to step back and look at their manufacturing base. All the meanwhile, we potentially get less competitive.
Yes. And there's talk now about more tariffs coming on copper. And that's going to have a huge impact because, as we all know, copper is the major component in a wire harness. And that's not just the auto industry. All your appliances, all of those, I wouldn't say all of those, but a significant portion of those wire harnesses are made in Mexico. And if we have a tariff on copper plus a tariff on products coming from Mexico, we're going to be into this world of a new term, tariff stacking. Products are going to be subject to multiple tariffs, but they also may be subject to multiple tariffs multiple times as they cross the border several times. So this could be an enormous impact, not only to the supply base, but to the consumer. There's still a lot of misunderstanding out there about who pays the tariff. To be clear, the company that imports the product pays the tariff. They get to decide if they are going to pass it on to their customer or not. So will the consumer be impacted? Yes. How much? We don't know yet, but it's happening, isn't it?
It is. There's no question. And I don't think anyone's anti-tariff. They're strategic tools that can be deployed and utilized. But right now, they are a very large umbrella to raise the revenues of the U.S. Treasury and to drive onshoring overnight, so to speak. And that's not possible. What we really were hoping for, still hold out hope for, is that there is a reopening of the USMCA, which is stipulated by the agreement in 2026, that we pull that up and we work with our trading partners to work out the difficulties of the bugs. And it does need to be updated. NAFTA was long overdue to be updated. Before that, there was a Canada-US agreement that didn't even include Mexico. So we've evolved, and we've evolved even more. The issue of Chinese components and vehicles potentially coming through Mexico, that needs to be addressed in USMCA. So we're hoping that's the process. This is not the way we had anticipated things. The sky is not falling. This is a resilient industry that has been through a lot. We're going to figure this out. But right now, there's going to be some potential short-term implications, which hopefully do not lead to permanent damage.
Yeah. Do you see this straining the relationships between the OEMs and the supply base?
There's the potential for that. There always is. You've been in this industry a long time, been on one side of the table. They have to work together. 75% of the components that make up a vehicle come from the suppliers. A large portion of the R&D and new technology comes from the suppliers. It's a symbiotic relationship that is often strained. We know that. But I think this has the potential to cause a lot of strain, because if these input costs go up and they get passed up the supply chain, and there's going to be a lot of disagreements about that, there's maybe going to be some rejection about that. That causes strain. I don't know what's going to happen. Hopefully it doesn't, because it's all hands on deck for this industry to figure out how do we make this work as best we can.
Yeah. Some OEMs are signaling that, yes, we will work with you, supply base, and other OEMs are signaling basically, no, keep shipping, you're under contract and keep shipping. And that's a bit of a head in your sand, stick your head in the sand kind of approach. I think you've got to be open to negotiations. You can't just blindly say, nope, not talking, ship to the contract, that's it. You can't take that attitude. This has got to be a collaborative effort between OEM and supplier so that we can get through this. Otherwise, we're going to end up typical type of disagreement. Suppliers will stop shipping, and then we'll bring the industry to a halt. And we definitely do not want that to happen.
No, it doesn't take much to disrupt things, and we have a big disruption right now. And the best thing we can do is continue to educate and inform the administration. Our organization, MichAuto, has reached out to all of our congressional delegation. We have 7 Republicans and 6 Democrats in our House of Representatives delegation, and we obviously have 2 Democratic senators. We're communicating with them all the time about what the implications and ramifications are. Same thing with the White House. And I know that the big OEMs and big suppliers are in DC doing that too. I'm still thinking and hoping that calmer heads will prevail, but I also heard the president say very clearly that these are not going to go away anytime soon.
No.
And so we now have the open issue of Canada and Mexico. We have the steel and aluminum. We have the import on all imports, and then we have the reciprocal. So we have a lot of things going, to use your phrase, that are stacking.
Yes. Yes, we do. We do. I will say this. I almost hesitate to say this because I know the listeners are going to be going, what? There's one bright spot in all of this, and that is it is training us to make sure that we have visibility into the supply chain. Because now in every executive leadership team, in every executive leadership conference room in this industry today, they're looking at the head of supply chain and purchasing going, what does this mean? So in order to be able to answer that question, because we need to know in terms of cost, when is it going to hit? How is it going to impact the P&L? How is it going to impact the balance sheet? So many questions. But in order to answer those questions, you have to have visibility all the way through your supply chain, through the tiers. And you have to understand how many times it crosses the borders. Understand exactly what level of tariff applies to what classification of the product. Are your products in the right tariff classification? So many questions. Tariff engineering is a thing now to make sure that your products have the right classification. Right. So all of these questions have to be asked and answered very quickly. And that requires you to have that visibility and to have the technology and the data analytics in place to be able to pull that data. So it is going to focus us on true supply chain transparency like we've never had to experience this before.
Yes.
Because these things are changing. We know what this is today, but it could be different tomorrow. And we know there's a new set of tariffs coming on April 2nd. I do see that. I'm trying to look for the positive here, Glenn. I do see that as one positive.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree with everything you just said. Look, I get up in the morning and I'm privileged to be able to do what I do and communicate with the men and women who lead these companies, who work in the plants and who operate these companies. And I know how determined they are. They are resilient people who've been through a lot. Just look what we've been through just in the last several years with chip shortage, with COVID. And it wasn't that long ago that we had the financial meltdown. You know, what companies have to do, and I know they're doing this, is how do I make myself better right now? Like, how do I roll my sleeve out? I got to deal with this. I can't make this go away. How am I going to be better to be able to compete? They're already thinking like that. It's like that old adage, don't waste a good crisis. Yeah. And so I always subscribe to these inflection points that hit us and think about what does that mean? And Andy Grove wrote a great book, the founder, chairman of Intel, called Only the Paranoid Survive. And he talks about inflection point. That's a major force of change that impacts a business. That is what we have again right now. So how do you figure out how to take the upward trajectory on that inflection point and not be a victim of it? Because you can't stay the same. That's not how things work. So I think we have the opportunity that you laid out. And I think we have the opportunity, the challenge in front of us is how do we make ourselves better and how do we compete to win?
Yeah, there you go. That's it. And that's a perfect way to end this discussion today. But before we close, Glenn, how are you advising your membership and the CEOs that you deal with in the Tier 1 space? How are you advising them at this point?
The first thing I'm doing is listening. I usually am. Some people say, where do you live? And I say, I live in my car. I've been out visiting a lot of companies and talking to people one-on-one to hear what they're doing, how they're reacting. So the first thing you do is listen. What we're trying to do is be a resource, and we're trying to really be that voice that communicates, again, to our federal legislators, to our local legislators, to our policymakers, and everything we can do to be part of that collective voice. We work very closely with the other associations. We have a synergy call that we do once a month with Michigan manufacturers, with MEMA, with CADIA, with the economic development people. Representative Dingell joins that call. Representative Stevens joins that call. Once a month, we get together for 45 minutes to collectively talk about what we should be working on together. So the collective voice is a much stronger. So that's what we're doing, is listening and trying to be that voice.
Yes. And so I think the message to the supply base is this: there are organizations there. If you're not engaged with MichAuto, with MEMA, with one of these organizations that are there to represent your voice and represent your interests, really now is the time to get connected. And I would say from a leadership perspective, this is an opportunity for great leaders to shine. This is an opportunity to step up, bring calm to the chaos and the crisis. Are things crazy? Is there uncertainty? Do you know what tomorrow's going to bring? You don't know. But as a leader, you can bring a sense of calm and confidence by, first of all, being truly authentic and saying, look, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but one thing I do know is that we are in this together and we're going to find a way through it. And I think with that mindset, we will get through this and we will come out stronger and a better automotive industry than before it. It's just going to be a little challenging along the way. But Glenn, it has been great having you on the show today. Thank you for your time, and I'm sure we'll be bringing you back.
It was a pleasure, Jan. Thanks for your time.